the poor, in other words, Democrats from the polls. But Governor Tom Corbett's administration said it would affect just 1% of eligible voters. Well, new data released by the state puts that number quite a bit higher. Nearly 1 in every 10 registered voters is lacking the primary form of ID required to receive a ballot. That's a state driver's license or alternative state ID. President Obama, you'll remember, carried Pennsylvania in 2008 by 11 points. Now, the counties that he won are in blue. According to the new data, the highest concentration of registered voters without state ID are in Philadelphia. You can see it circled. That's to the east. And Allegheny County, that's Pittsburgh, to the west. Both were Democratic strongholds in '08. Penda Hare is co-director of the Advancement Project, and David Freddoso is the editorial page editor of the Washington Examiner. Mr. Freddoso, sometimes you hear a story and it's taking place far from where you live and you're not quite sure what to make of it because you're not on the ground. This is not that story for me. I went to Wawa this morning in the community where I was born and raised at 7 o'clock, and I got the local newspaper, and it speaks of how 70,000 voters in 2 counties, Bucks and Montgomery County, where I've spent my entire life, born in one, living in the other, are now in jeopardy. And I can tell you we have absolutely no history of voter fraud that would justify jeopardizing 70,000 people from exercising the franchise. What do you make of all this?
Well, I would start by backing up and looking at the larger picture here. First of all, the state is sending out letters to just about everybody in this category that you've mentioned who'd be affected to explain what the new law does and what sorts of voter ID are acceptable. College IDs are generally acceptable for colleges in Pennsylvania. Even if they don't have expiration dates, the school can put one on in the form of a sticker.
I don't think these are college students we're talking about.
Oh, now, hang on. I'm just starting here. Any sort of military ID, any driver's license, and the alternative form. But the idea is that anyone can get one for free. And if they weren't doing that, then I think that it would be perhaps, the fears might be a lot more justified. But they're making things as easy as possible here. And look, you don't need a history of people, marching in en masse and the numbers in the thousands going in and voting under other people's names in order to realize that, yes, it's just common sense that people should show who they are when they vote.
Well,
this is the way every other country does it. Mexico just had an election in which every voter had to do this.
Let me just respond, if I might, and then, Penda, I'll come to you. I don't have a problem conceptually with the notion of showing an ID before you vote. But you've got to be reasonable and take into account the community that you're serving and say, hey, what kind of an ID might the folks who reside here possess? And when I look in my hometown newspaper and I see that in the county where I was born, 25,449 lack a driver's license or state-issued non-driver's license, and then the county where I live now, 44,952. It really brings it home for me. Penda, what's going on here?
Well, what's going on is that the state of Pennsylvania has passed one of the most onerous barriers to voting that I've ever seen. As you said, they've knocked out 750,000 voters or more. That's registered voters with one fatal swoop. And, for example, we're suing, Advancement Project is suing over this law, and our case is going to court in a couple of weeks. And we are very, very hopeful that the court will strike this down because we have a 93-year-old plaintiff who marched with Martin Luther King, who cannot get her birth certificate and therefore can't get the ID. This law disenfranchises students. It's not true that their college IDs are acceptable. It disenfranchises people that don't drive, who are mostly low income. 85% of Pennsylvania colleges do not have an expiration date on their ID.
And all they need is a sticker. That's what the law says.
And you have to do that for so many people in such a short amount of time. This law was passed in March. There's no way that you can get an ID for close to 1 million people in this short of amount of time.
Mr. Freddoso, I have to say, let me just get this in if I might. It seems awfully coincidental, and I'm not a believer in coincidence, that as the country faces the re-election of the nation's first African-American president, you've got in excess of 24 states going in a direction that they've never gone before.
I mean, in fact, these laws go back more than a decade at this point. They've been passed in various places. My home state of Indiana put one into effect, I believe, sometime in the middle of the last decade. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, and
I don't normally. I don't normally. I think we went to the moon, and I don't think much happened in Area 51, and I think that Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. But this is pretty darn compelling.
Well, again, it makes a lot of sense. The first time I heard that it wasn't required, I wondered how in the world is that not required. Every single voter who voted in the Mexican election that just occurred had to show a photographic ID. Everyone in Europe who votes, in fact, the Pennsylvania law, there are some cases where people who have religious objections to being photographed, they don't actually need a photo ID.
The Amish. Let me show you something, because critics say that the voter ID laws are a solution in search of a problem, and that the real agenda is tamping down Democratic turnout. Pennsylvania House Majority Leader Mike Turzai took some heat last month when he included it in a laundry list of Republican initiatives. Now watch this.
We are focused on making sure that we meet our obligations that we've talked about for years. Pro-Second Amendment, the Castle Doctrine's done. First pro-life legislation, abortion facility regulations in 22 years, done. Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania, done.
Voter ID, which will allow Governor Romney to win Pennsylvania. Penda, that would seem to bring down the balance, wouldn't it, that this is all about voter suppression and not ballot security?
Absolutely. We know he admitted why this was enacted, and we know that there is a right-wing group associated with the Republican Party that sent out these laws to all the states, and they were rammed through for partisan purposes. And I'm a nonpartisan organization. I'm concerned about the voters, and I'm concerned about democracy, which is being bulldozed in an effort to gain a partisan advantage. We know that President Obama won Pennsylvania by 500,000 or 600,000 votes in 2008, and now three-quarters of a million people to 1 million people, we think, just of registered voters, not even counting the new people that will be trying to get registered, are obviously blocked out of voting unless they can balance all of these hurdles quickly.
Thank you, Penda Hare. Thank you, David Ferdoso. We appreciate your being here. Up next, Republican Congressman Joe Walsh is still trying to make the case that his opponent, Iraq war veteran Tammy Duckworth, isn't a real war hero, despite losing her legs in Iraq. Tammy Duckworth joins us next. This is Hardball, the place for politics.